Thank you everybody for joining us today. Karen and I have had several conversations about this work. I first saw it when it was presented in Brixton at Block 336, and really wanted to reach out to Karen and have a conversation around the work. So we've had quite a few in the lead up to the show being installed, so it's nice to be back here now, see it in the space in which it was made, see it occupied in the way in which Karen intended, and kind of talk through some of the background and the context that this show sits within today. So to kick off, it'd be great to get a sense of the initial ideas and concerns and motivations that prompted you to begin making this body of work.
Yeah. Well, I've been actually working a lot in post-colonialism for my entire, career, as far as I can remember, really, and the legacies of post-colonialism. And my work is very research-based. So whenever I'm going into any kind of project, I actually go into a very long period of research before I actually start working. And I had done the sugar houses. I don't know if anybody has seen my website, but I had done these sugar houses, and that really sort of led me to resistance. And during the process of actually researching for that project, I had come across I was reading a book by Hilary Beckers, who is a historian in Barbados, and he wrote this book called Natural Rebels, and there was a chapter in that called Breeding Wenches, and that really stuck with me for a long time, and I felt that I really wanted to go back to that, to understand what happened during slavery, and how they actually bred the enslaved woman. So yeah, that was really a lot of the motivation. Also, so there was this resistance. There was a lot happening in that year. I think it was 2018. So it was International Women's Day, and there was so much happening around that. There was the suffragettes, there were all these other great women, and I just felt like, wait, hold on a minute. Where are our Caribbean women? Where's the story really of our Caribbean women? Plus, history is really history. It was written by men, for men, about men. I really wanted to get her story out there. I thought it was so important. So those were the things that were really kind of guiding me. And actually, while I started doing that research, the Brazilian Carnival that year, which I think that was a resistance to Bolsonaro becoming the president. That was about a woman slave as well, who her husband was Zumbi, and he led the resistance, but nobody knew anything about her. So they actually brought her out, and they heroed her, and they created a song, and I mean, it was fantastic. They actually won the carnival that year as well. So the woman, the enslaved woman, has actually been under the carpet for a long time. And I just felt that her story really needed to be told, because her experiences were so different to the male slave. And it has actually only been within the last 20, 30 years that academics are now writing about the enslaved woman, because her experience was completely different to his experience.
And different in the Caribbean, and different in North America, and different in Canada.
America, yeah.
So it's interesting seeing all of the kind of discourse that's unfolding now, looking very kind of closely at the nuances and complexity of that history.
Yes, and also that even though they are different, they have so many similarities as well.
Well, because there's a technology that's put in place that's intended, to create a system in which, yes, that can be replicated across all of these different landscapes.
Yeah. And so therefore we have to fight against that. Yeah.
And so the invitation was to create an installation for this space, for this gallery.
Yes.
What was your kind of process of thinking about how you would utilize this space and how you would create this monument that you created in here?
Yeah, well, well, I guess, when you're preparing for an exhibition like this, you actually have to come into the space quite a few times. And I knew from the onset that it was 10 meters tall. So I knew whatever I was creating was going to have to be quite big, So as I said before, the research took very many months. I think I probably researched for like about 4 or 5 months. And through the research, I realized immediately that the sack, the Hessian sack, again, the Hessian sack is another material from my childhood. When we went crab hunting as children on the beach, the Hessian sack was always there when we had to make ice cream and go for the ice. My father would take the Hessian sack. So I use a lot of materials from my childhood memories. And also, it's really important for me when I'm starting to work that I get the material to carry the heavy load, that the material becomes a metaphor that really carries the load for me and speaks the language of what I want to see. So, yeah, I guess, once I got that picture from the Blood Alley picture, I don't know if anybody knows, there's this picture, it's circa around 1930 of the West India docks, and it was nicknamed in those days Blood Alley because the sugar came from the Caribbean, it docked at West India docks, and then the stevedores would put the sacks of sugar on their backs, but by the end of the day, because of the harshness of the Hessian, their backs would be bleeding. So somebody had sent me this beautiful photograph of the sacks actually washed and drying from one warehouse to the other, and the stevedores at the bottom just, trucking the bags of sugar. And that, for me, was a very powerful image that really gave me a lot of inspiration in creating the work.
And materiality and materials is fundamental to all of the work that you do.
Yes.
I mean, it's interesting, as we've been talking about this work a lot, tracing the kind of historical lineages of some of the objects that you're using.
Yeah.
Because as you mentioned, growing up in the Caribbean, these are around you. Hessian sacks are around you.
Yeah.
Some of these items are around you. And so there is a kind of historical mining that you undergo.
Yes.
To learn about the origins and the uses, and then retool them.
Yes.
To tell a different story, to comment on commerce, to
Yeah.
comment on politics,
Yeah.
to comment on the ways in which materials can be gendered.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit more about, in addition to the Hessian sacks that you mentioned, some of the other materials that you're employing here?
Yeah.
Give the audience a sense of the decisions that you made to come to use them.
Yeah.
And what you're saying with your use of them.
Yeah. So the first of all, the sack itself is a form. It's a rectangular form. So that was the first thing I didn't want to mess with at all. I wanted to keep that form. And then, as part of my research, I also went to the West India Docks, which is the London Dockland Museum now. And the very first picture, as you walk into that museum, actually, is the sacks of sugar coming from Trinidad, where I am from originally. And of course, in those days, it was called BWI, British West Indies. And there's this gorgeous, huge picture taking up a big wall like this of all the sacks coming in, and they're just sitting on the ground, BWI, Trinidad, and so the first thing I did was take a photograph of that, because the text on that was actually Helvetica New, and Helvetica New is one of the oldest texts used in commercialization and transport, one of the oldest transportation texts. So I did a lot of research around Helvetica New, so all the text on the work is Helvetica New. So that was one of the first things that came out of the research, what text I was going to use to suggest this commodification, of the enslaved people that were being brought from Africa. Then you have the gold. So the enslaved women were bred, and every time they were able to have a child, that child was added to the labor force. So that was free labor for the enslaver. He didn't have to pay money to bring that new labor onto the plantation. So the wombs were actually screen printed in gold to reference the commodification again of the enslaved woman's womb. Then I used branding. So they were brought on the ships from Africa, but from the time they landed, like for instance, the Duke of York, his Royal African Company, his branding would be DY. So all his slaves were branded DY. So I decided, and I also have one of those branding tools at home that I've been working with for a long period of time. But once I got into the commodification of the woman, I decided to then brand the sacks. And the sack, I haven't said before, but the Hessian sack was very critical because Hessian sacks have been known for their durability. You know, they've been a vessel to transport commercial items for years and years and years. The material itself is known for its strength. So the Hessian sack was very important because of the strength and how stoic these women were in the face of, the adversity and oppression that they went through. I was also working in the Black Cultural Archives, where I went to visit the Gale Plantation, and that is a plantation in Jamaica. And they have a very small collection in that archive of the, what do you call it again? Yeah. The what? Indenture. The indenture. So the indenture is it's almost like a deed that they used in very old days. So when they sold the house, they would give you the indenture with all the information on it, when the house was built, blah, blah, blah. And for the first time, I actually was able to see an indenture with everything on it, including the slaves. And the indenture was amazing in the fact that they were classified as male, female, distempered females, but everything in the indenture were the shackles, in other words, that were attached to the plantation, and that was all being sold as one unit. And I'd never actually seen an indenture like that before, so that was quite interesting. So the names actually come from the indenture, Clarissa, Jacinta, Harriet, they all come from the indenture that I visited, the Gale Plantation indenture. And in those days, of course, enslaved people were part of the livestock. They were not human. And in particular, they could not be called Miss, because Miss was a very specific title reserved for white ladies. So using the Miss really, gives them back their humanity and allows us to really reconnect with them and bring them back to life, really.
And in addition to the names that you include, you depict Queen Nani, who is the figure behind us.
Yeah.
And this is actually a composite image that you've created.
Yes.
Can you give a bit more context to how you came, your research into looking for images of Queen Nani, and then how you came to create this image that we're seeing here?
Yeah. So Nani is is Queen Nani, as she's known in Jamaica. Nani was an ex-slave. She was a maroon. She escaped to cockpit country, to the hills, and there she created her own maroon community. And Nani was she's a national hero in Jamaica now because she was able to really defeat the British. You know, she was very smart. She outsmarted them in so many ways. She ran the Windward Maroons. She was a great leader. She was a great warrior, and her abeng was one of the methods that she actually used to in her group of Maroons. So they were able to send coded messages to each other, and that's what the English could not understand. They could not understand, you know, and those were the ways that they were able to beat them. So in the end, the British decided, well, we can't win the Maroons, the Windward Maroons. We would sign a treaty with them. So that was the only way that they can actually beat her.
Coexist.
Yes, coexist, yes, that's a good word.
For lack of a better one.
Yes.
But talking a bit about the composite image, so you were trying to look for images of Nani, even though she is a national hero.
Yes.
There were 2 images that you could find in Jamaica.
Yes.
And then decided to kind of
bring them together.
Together to make this image.
So of course Nani existed in the 1700s, and in those days they did not have cameras. So there are no actual proper photographs of Nani as such. So I had to, there's a sculpture of Nani in the Jamaican National Hero Park. She's the only woman hero, and I was able to take that, and I guess it all comes down from oral history, how they created Nani, because from one generation to the next, they passed on this image of Nani. They knew that Nani always had her necklace on. They knew that her abeng was a really important part. They knew that she wore her head ties. So they created their own sculpture, and I took the image of that sculpture. I also did some research around this sort of dresses that they would have been wearing in the 1700s on the plantation. And the one with the abeng at the bottom, those are actually lashes of cane, you know, the little bits of, like, you can see like so that was taken from one of the cane fields, and they would have probably worn more like this in the late 1700s, coming into the early 1800s. So, and of course the machete was a big part of another resistance too. So Nani was born out of that composition, really, and research. And
the importance of storytelling and folklore in your work, in addition to the oral history of Nani, also arises with Anansi, who can be seen calling through the window. There's a brilliant essay by Emily Zobel Marshall on the website about Anansi and the history of Anansi, the nuances of Anansi in a Caribbean context versus an African context. But speaking from the Caribbean context, do you want to talk a little bit more about what Anansi represents for you in the installation, what that figure brings to this piece? So Nancy's part of our folklore in the Caribbean. So when you're growing up as a child in the Caribbean, there are Nancy stories everywhere. And so again, this is another part of my childhood that just comes with me, and I guess becomes a part of what I'm doing. And he is really a symbol of resistance. So the stories, if you know Nancy's stories, Nancy is a little bit like Queen Nani, really. He learns how to survive. So not all of his stories are great stories, but he has to. It's about survival, and survival in a really oppressive situation. And of course, the Africans brought Anansi stories with them on that ship, and it never actually left them. They told stories to themselves. I guess they used the stories as to create their own
methods of resistance, and also to pass those stories down, that oral history down to their children. You have to remember that slavery existed in the Caribbean for 400 years, and for 400 years Anansi stories survived and still continue to survive. People are still telling Anansi stories, So he is very critical to the plantation environment. And if you can imagine that after a hard day's work, the family is finally reunited in their little shack or their little log cabin, and it's been a harsh, oppressive day, and they need some sort of relief. It was also a form of relief for them. Enslaved people also had families, so it's time for them to eat together, have story time with their children, and to pass these stories on, which was really critical in their survival.
And you, through the work, and this is also in the essay in the wall text, you speak about the notion of rival geographies.
Yeah.
That you take from Stephanie Camp, is that
Yes,
correct? So Stephanie Camp is an important influence in the
Yes,
research behind the work. And Stephanie speaks about rival geographies, which were these alternative geographies that were mapped by enslaved people as they tried to counter the oppressive structures that were built within the Caribbean, within North America, which is where Camp is writing about. So can you speak a little bit about, first, your discussion of rival geographies in the sense of historically within this work, but then I think also through what you're doing through this piece, you are charting a somewhat rival geography in how the Caribbean is represented in a British context.
Yeah.
To kind of unearth some of the complexities and the lack of a detailed history as it can exist outside of the Caribbean in the West. And in a way, I think there is a kind of a Nancy-ness to the insertion of certain narratives through materials, through this kind of very beautiful aestheticization of the objects you're using. There is a bit of a slip, there is a bit of an unearthing of a different geography that perhaps is not discussed in arts institutions in the West. So speak a little bit about that kind of historical rival geography within the work, but then also perhaps a methodology that you're trying to utilize yourself by introducing these conversations to a context. Like the visual arts.
So, one of the most important ways of getting slavery to work was really about containment of the enslaved. So if you could imagine a plantation, at any given day there were more blacks than whites. And that was the thing that feared them the most, that they would have some sort of revolution on the plantation. So plantation owners and enslavers really worked hard in trying to contain their enslaved. And in so doing, they mapped out only certain places that the enslaved can go to. And so by containing movement, they contain the revolutions that they envisaged could happen. And that is one of the things that enslaved people did so well. They did not adhere to that at all. They actually used the spaces where they weren't allowed to go to have their outlaw parties. And the work is made very much in the spirit of the women who planned for these parties, because the women, they really took these parties on very seriously. So they prepared long in advance. They pilfered cotton that they were weaving in the nights for the masters to make their own dresses. They made their own dresses. They dyed the dresses in the indigo that was another crop that they were actually planting, all that sort of stuff. So each sack is made. I got sacks from before. I split them up. I made each one. I wanted to imbue each sack with value, because I just wanted this work to have so much value in it, and so the work is made very much in that mindset, yes, and so the parties were very celebratory occasions for them. They cooked, they danced, they had competitions amongst each other where they would carry water on their heads and dance. Some of the ladies made shoes to match their dress, and they actually have oral testimonies saying, "Oh my God, the shoes hurt my foot so much, but I danced all night." They really enjoyed the whole thing, and it has to be said that it was at great risk, because if they were found, a lot of times what happened is that the people who were looking for them, the supervisors or whoever, the men would rape the women right there, and they would beat the men. So it was at great risk that they did things like this, but they had to find a way to enjoy their own bodies. They had to find a way to go out and enjoy life, to get away from the oppressive environment, and they did it very well. They managed it in really amazing ways. The men had a lot more freedom than the women, because the men were employed to go out of the plantation and deliver goods from one plantation to the other, but the women weren't. The women did not get those passes, and those passes were very specific passes. This is Tom Jones, leave plantation, Gale plantation at 7:15 a.m., arrive at next plantation, return on certain. They were very, very specific. So caught outside of that at any given time was a great risk for the person with the pass. The women, on the other hand, were not allowed to, move around like that at all. But they found ways in the plantation. They had their own little system of, sending messages to each other. The domestics, of course, worked inside the house. They got access to information. So yeah, wherever there was some form of containment, they were able to, find their own way of getting past it. And even though Stephanie Camp does write a lot about what was happening in the South of America, a lot of it, also happened in the Caribbean. Like, one of the things I did not realize that was so prolific in the Caribbean was infanticide. I thought that was more a South American thing, but it was actually quite prolific in the Caribbean. And so the baby sacks are there to actually reference the infanticide. That was a way of enslaved women taking control of their bodies, because when they did not want to be bred anymore, or did not want their kids to be sent into the labor force, the enslaved labor force, they would carry out infanticide as an act of love.
Yeah, that is actually the historical narrative of that is currently on the history syllabus for CXC history in the Caribbean.
Oh, really?
So it's very much taught. It's a history that's taught.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, very much so. And we're talking about the historical narratives of the plantation. But when we came to the show for the first time, I was thinking very much about the resonances between this show and Keith's show downstairs. Everyone's had a chance to see it. But Keith is talking very much about, yes, the future, but climate change change in the future, and the impact of what's happening to the climate. That narrative is in his work. And I don't think we can talk about the colonial system, we can't talk about plantation histories without thinking about the resonances of that today. That is a huge impact on the climate change that we are experiencing, this system that was set up to have such detrimental damage to the land within the Caribbean and beyond.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you feel about the two shows speak to each other? If you're I do think, it's pretty amazing they weren't scheduled to be together, both of these two shows. It's just happened as a result of the delays because of the pandemic. But I do think it's quite powerful that they are on at the same time.
Yeah.
What are your feelings about having that dialogue going on.
Yeah, I think it's really very interesting that we're showing together. And I'm honored to be showing next to Keith. Yeah, and you know, I felt after I put the exhibition up and I went away, and then I came back and had a chance to, you know, to see it and then go downstairs. I actually felt like, you know, that, yeah, people from the Caribbean are actually colonizing this space at the moment. It's a sort of reversal, you know, of what happened before. But then I was having a conversation with Jill Berry, Professor Berry, who wrote the essay, and she says, are you sure it's colonization or is it a decolonization? So that's quite an interesting conversation to have, really. Are we decolonizing the gallery or are we colonizing the gallery? And I guess in a lot of ways it's both, you know. But I think it's great, you know, because I feel anyway, as someone coming from the Caribbean, there's been so much apolitical work around, you know, previous to Black Lives Matter and what was happening last year and COVID and so on, that it's nice. You know, for me anyway, I like when work is political. You know, it really gives it such a great dimension. And I'm kind of glad now that, you know, on both levels of this gallery, you know, there's so much conversation happening in the work that it's political and engaging.
And I think it shows that, you know, a real investment in learning about and engaging with these histories.
Yes.
By everyone. You know, it adds another kind of layer of understanding to work like Keith's, which is talking about, you know, a kind of very contemporary-centered conversation. But I think, you know, that exchange, that kind of looking back and looking forward that you both are doing, really lends to the importance of a community engagement with these issues, and thinking about it on a kind of wider spectrum of information. I mean, we've been speaking a lot about the increase in shows looking at particularly the British Caribbean recently, group shows and, you know, some kind of smaller solo shows. And I think what was really exciting for me with this show was it was grounded in the Caribbean, right? So much of the conversation is looking at, you know, what happens once people from the Caribbean come to Britain, and what is the conversation that unfolds here? What is the cultural story? You know, what are the experiences? And for me, you know, you are kind of grounding this body of work in the Caribbean and talking about women who lived in the Caribbean, and the experiences of people in the Caribbean and our conversations around resistance in the Caribbean, and an ongoing engagement with this history as grounded in the Caribbean is really, really important. And I don't know if you want to speak a little bit about, across your whole body of work, how you do that, how you bring yourself back, even though you're based here, that constant going back that you undertake through your work.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess for me, it's because it's not there. It's not there for me. You know, my history isn't tangible outside. You know, if I go out, it's not there. And I need, you know, when I came to live here, I just said, oh, you know, Britain, you know, that's the great thing for me about Britain, how they love their history. And then I couldn't find my history anywhere, you know, and so it was kind of impossible for me to really settle until I guess I had to make my own history. You know, I think that's what the work is doing, really. It's really sort of unpicking that history. And I think it's so important that it's out there. I really think that the curriculum does need to be decolonized, and for it to be, you know, just part of the mainstream history. I mean, it's such a fiasco what happened last week with the royals going to the Caribbean, you know, and realizing that, you know, the Caribbean people are not going to look at them the same way that they looked at them before. And actually pushing them now to realize that, you know, we are still living this legacy. And when I started my degree at Birmingham City University, I remember the buzzword at the time was post-colonialism is dead. It was 2001 we started, was it? 2002?
I started in 2006.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I did, true. I took long to do everything. So post-colonialism was dead, and there I was going back and forth to the Caribbean, and I'm saying, dead? I'm living this thing every day, you know, and I just felt that I needed to express it, you know, and to make my own history, and I guess to create this body of work that really speaks about this history, and this work is actually very much made again with Alice Walker in mind, because Alice Walker talks about her quilts and the quilts being this everyday use. So, you know, the sack is this everyday use thing that was around me my whole childhood. But then, you know, the women in South of America, the enslaved women, they made their quilts because they had to keep warm and they needed something to sleep on, you know. But these quilts also allowed them to escape the patriarchy of the plantation. It also allowed them to create a heritage. So a lot of the times when they make their quilts, they use materials from their great-grandmothers or their aunts or whoever, and they create this lineage and this heritage. So I guess the wall hanging is creating this heritage.
Thank you. Should we open it up to questions? How are we doing for time?
Yeah, so the Walsall, so I engaged with the Walsall Black Sisters, and they are a group of basically Windrush women, and they actually embroidered the name for me, Aren't I a Woman, you know. So it was interesting going to their little group and connecting with them. And these women came, most of them, from 1948 onwards, during the Windrush period, and listening to their stories and how they still feel about living in the environment today. And it's really quite sad that they don't feel connected. They still feel that, you know, if their kids, their sons or their daughters or whoever do anything that they're not supposed to do, that they will end up in prison, or, you know, so they're still very disconnected, and that was interesting. You know, just in connecting with them and listening to their own stories. So unfortunately, a lot of them have now died since COVID. But they engaged with the project ever so happily, and and they did the sacks, the baby sacks outside. So the baby sacks are hung on manillas. So there's also a lot of material that references the capitalism, the amount of money that was made from slavery in the project. So manillas were one of the first forms of currency that were used, and that's what the baby sacks are hung on. And then we have a lot of cowrie shells, and the cowrie shells were also a form of currency used during the very beginning of slavery. And I've also added 22 karat gold beaded and 20 karat gold beaded beads, gold plated beads, to once again imbue the pieces with a lot of value. And I think that's it, really. I think that's it in terms of the materials.
Yeah. I mean, I really do encourage everyone go and read the essays on the website, because they both address kind of different approaches to the work. One from the perspective of Nancy. And then the other does kind of, you know, run through the use of the materials in a really thorough way. So it's great to have those.
Yeah, the essays are very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, it was Ain't I a Woman was a speech by Sojourner Truth in 1800s. And for my research, I read Aren't I a Woman by Deborah Gray White. And she writes about it's very interesting. Of course, she writes about the South American experience. And, you know, after doing the research and realizing how stoic these women were in the face of everything that they experienced, you know, as Stephanie Camp says, the enslaved woman had 3 bodies, you know, the body on the plantation that was worked to death, the body that was violated and sexually violated, and also the body that they enjoyed, that they fell in love, and that they danced and they partied. So, you know, the enslaved woman had these 3 different bodies. And how they pulled through, you know, how stoic they were, how they managed. I mean, the list I have from all the research of the different methods of resistance that the enslaved woman used on an everyday basis, you know, to get through that experience. I mean, I don't think we touched actually on plants, and that was a huge part of their resistance methods, because they came with this vast knowledge of plants from Africa. And of course, in those days, they were bringing plants like the breadfruit tree and all that from Africa to plant in the Caribbean. And so African women were able to use that in as tools in their armor. So they poisoned their masters sometimes when they couldn't take it. They committed abortions when they didn't want to have children. And again, there's a lot of evidence that shows that pre-emancipation, childbirth slowed down. You know, they took control of their wombs. They decided when they wanted to have their children. And then as time evolved, and just as word was spreading about emancipation, they again began to allow themselves to have children. So you can see, you know, the decline in childbirth before, and then as emancipation was getting closer and closer, you can start to see an increase in them having children. So when you look at how they survived, I mean, I couldn't call this thing anything else but aren't I a woman, but with no question mark. I changed that question mark to an exclamation mark immediately. You know, it was just so appropriate.
And we went back and forth about as well, like where to put that piece that has the title on it, whether to include it, whether to not to.
Yeah.
And I kind of felt like it's not just the title, like it is one of the works, right? Like it kind of, it is so central to the work. It's not just the kind of title that got added at the end. I mean, it was this kind of really centering point for you. So yeah, I'm glad that it's up there. And it kind of, as you walk into the show, that's, you know, that proclamation is what you're greeted with.
Yeah. I wish. Yeah, I know. I don't know. I mean, nothing has happened yet, and I'm really hoping that it tours after here, because it would be just a shame to really put it all away. I remember when we had the show in Brixton at Block 336, you know, unfortunately that show was only for a month, and people were on Instagram going, well, can't we put it somewhere else, you know what I mean? But again, my work, the size of it, like Blue Power was 80 crosses and 12,000 boats. You know, this is 6 meters tall, you know. I think that's a challenge for most galleries. And hopefully somebody is having a look at it and thinking that it needs to be at their gallery and they have space for it.
Just following on from that last one quickly, I think the point about, I mean, obviously the global impact of, you know, what these empires were doing at the time means that these objects have resonances for cultures and places all over the world. So it's really interesting to think about how, you know, the material culture that feels like, as you say, you grew up with it in the Caribbean, having that exchange, you know, a kind of cross-cultural boundaries to think about how this work could reach different audiences.
Yeah, and open different discourses. Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if anybody has seen it on the website, but this space is 10 meters high and block is 3 meters. So we had to come up with a way to show this. So what we did was we split this in two, and luckily again, because of the way that I have designed the work, it comes together with lots of Velcro tape and fasteners. So we were able to actually split it in two and create a corridor so that you actually walked into the work, almost womb-like, you know, and experienced it in a totally different way. And then we actually took the shells and the top row and we kind of made it, you know, in a nice sort of a swing that worked really beautifully as well, and it was more intimate. So because of the space, again, you were a lot more intimate with the work. But yeah, you know, and I hope that, you know, if a gallery is thinking of taking it on, they would realize that the work can be shown in different ways. Yes, for me.
Yeah.
I didn't call it any Hessian, I call it crocus. Where the crocus bag? No, and actually I did a lot of the branding and so on in Vanley Burke's allotment. Vanley and I are quite close, and I, you know, I did the open fire in his allotment and took the sacks down. And yeah, I mean, while we're down there, you know, Vanya and I are only talking about crocus bags. We're not talking about no Hessian sack, right? Yeah. Well, I wanted to actually reference the rival geographies that we were talking about, that containment, especially of the woman, you know. So I wanted to open up that conversation with this piece by putting this wire in front of her, by, you know, containing her, blocking her, showing, you know, it's almost fence-like in its, you know, in the material. So that's what that is about. This one really references more the containment of the enslaved woman and the rival geographies on the plantation.
Yeah, I found Stephanie Camp's discussion of fences very interesting.
Yes.
I didn't know a lot about that history of the introduction and the kind of the repositioning of fences as a kind of strategy of containment.
Yeah.
Another writer who's writing from the Canadian perspective, Catherine McKittrick, is also talking about alternative geographies in that way. It'd be really interesting to think about the two of them in dialogue from the Canadian and south of North America context.
Yes,
Really interesting.
exactly. Yeah.